don't want to embarrass anybody, but I was looking at the program and my translator, Kuwabata, Yukiko-san. So her first name, I don't know if I forgot it or not, but I just wanted to thank her. The storyteller. Human beings are storytellers, all of us. It's one of the things that sets us apart from animals, stories. There are many reasons to tell stories, but let me give you two. First, it's a way to share information. Long, long ago, parents used to tell stories to teach their children life lessons. They were stories that taught about the dangers around them or how to become a good, productive member of the village. Don't go into that cave over there. A bear will eat you. However, we all know that you can tell somebody something, tell them to do something, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to listen to you. So if you turn that information into a story and you make it entertaining, it might work a little better. There used to be a really nice kid who lived around here. Everyone in the village loved him, but he didn't like to listen to his elders. And one day he ventured into that cave and a big, giant black bear ate him up. The bear still lives there today. He's always hungry, and he wears the boy's bones as a necklace. Which is the second reason to tell stories? To entertain. If you teach and you entertain at the same time, it's all the better. Think about old fairy tales or folk myths, even superstitions. Let's take Momotaro. Not only a fun and wonderful tale, you might also learn that honorable, hardworking people become happy. Or if you're nice and you're generous to people and animals, they might help you when you need it. Or if you're loyal and courageous and all around good, you can accomplish great things and be a hero. Now, here it's important to note that the stories we tell are, even the made-up ones, they're not lies, they're not falsehoods, or they shouldn't be. The very best stories reveal truths about us and the world around us. That's part of the reason why I think we're drawn to them, and the reason that some of them have been passed down for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, some people are better at telling stories than others, and I think we can all agree on that. Think about a friend or family member or someone on YouTube who always has a wildly entertaining tale to tell. You listen and it's suspenseful, or it's funny, or it's sad, or it's all of those, but it feels like it's happening to you. Whether they're told or written down, stories are incredibly powerful, and they're magical too. So they do all these amazing things. They can educate us, they can make us think, they can transport us to another time and place, they can make us emotional. And here's another thing stories can do. They show us who we are. Every culture has a storytelling tradition. Cultures define themselves by their stories. I mentioned Momotaro, but Japan is also rich with stories about tiger skin wearing oni carrying large iron clubs, or long-nosed tengu who live in mountains and teach martial arts. What a marvelous place, Japan. Now, let's look much, much smaller. Us, all of us as individuals. We live our lives using stories to define who we are, how we see the world, and how we interact with it. We are our own bundle of stories, and we're pretty marvelous too. One second, I got my papers mixed up. So we're pretty marvelous too. My name is Terry. I was born in the United States, in Texas, and I've lived in many different places. When I was in university, I came to Japan to study, and I'm still here. Now, all that stuff is fact, but my story is a little more interesting. I'm an only child. After I was born, before I was even 1 year old, we moved to Alaska, where we spent 5 years. After that, my family moved to a new place every 1 to 5 years until I reached university. Being an only child, I was lonely and very shy, and I hated leaving my friends in school to be tossed into some new location all the way across the country. It was very hard for me to make new friends because I spoke a weird accent, I dressed weird, I did weird things, just a weird kid. But I loved to get lost in books, in stories. I loved to escape. I was 12 years old when I read Stephen King's The Shining, and it blew me away. I couldn't sleep for months. And I wanted to be able to do this thing. I wanted to do this to someone else. I began keeping journals, and I tried to write these creepy little stories that I read to my friends and neighbors. I was raised Catholic, and I went to a Catholic school. So yes, my teachers made me stop reading the stories of possessed dolls that murdered you in your sleep. I got in trouble. But early on, I kind of liked strange, scary things. And you know something else that's kind of strange and weird? A TV program that I was obsessed with as a child. So this is elementary school, and it played nothing but old Japanese TV shows and movies, shows like Godzilla and Ultraman. No matter where I went in America, all my stories that I got were princesses and frogs and castles and witches. But here was a place on Earth that had an enormous moth with 2 cute little singing ladies on her back, or a big turtle that breathed fire and saved children. Now this was cool. At the time, I don't think I realized the magical spell that those programs, that those stories had on me. But that was probably the first of 3 things that brought me to Japan. The second one was martial arts. I was infatuated with them. At the time, Bruce Lee was big, and there was a TV show called Kung Fu. Yeah, I know, it's Chinese, but it kind of opened the door to all martial arts for me. And I especially liked Aikido and Kendo. And the third thing that led me to Japan was religion. I hated it. Remember I said I was Catholic, raised Catholic. Even from a young age, I didn't like it. And it didn't make sense, actually. They told you to pray all the time and that whenever you prayed, God heard you. But then they told you that you had to confess your sins to a priest. So you had to tell the stranger everything you did wrong. And I tell them, no, I'm sorry, I talked to God last night. And they said, no, that doesn't work. You have to tell this person. They didn't believe me. There are a lot of contradictions in Catholicism and the Bible, which for me doesn't make for good story, because if you think about it, religion too is story. That's all it is. So in high school, I started studying martial arts and I started studying different religions. I quite liked the philosophy behind Taoism and Buddhism, especially Japanese Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, which is echoed in Japanese Shingon and Tendai sects. That all made more sense to me than some big angry God that was always telling me I should feel bad about myself. After high school, started university with absolutely no idea what I wanted to do in my life. At the time, all I knew is I still had the itch to write. I just had nothing to write about. I had no life experience. I remember promising myself that one day I'd publish a book with a traditional publisher. And I even made this little dream that one day Stephen King would read my stories and he'd like them. They were silly, they were huge, I know, but they were dreams and it kind of gave me a direction to go. There were no majors in my university for becoming a novelist, so I just kind of pointed myself in that direction. What was I going to do with my life? So let me tell you something else interesting about university in America. You can change your major as many times as you'd like. To graduate, all you need are the required number of credits, but no one's stopping you from switching majors to try to figure out what you want. You may need to take some extra classes or an extra year, but as long as you pay, you're fine. My father likes to joke that I had more majors than anyone in the history of the school. In the course of 4 years, I majored in business, world religion, architecture, pre-med, and finally international studies. I was in my 3rd year, university, still had no idea what I wanted to do. One day I'm walking down the hall to my advisor to talk to him about just this thing, and I saw a poster on the wall introducing a fully paid one-year scholarship to Japan. And I didn't think such a thing was possible. So I asked my advisor and he said, yeah, why don't you apply? So now I had a goal. As it turns out, my city, Omaha, Nebraska, is sister cities with Shizuoka. And my university, University of Nebraska at Omaha, is sister cities with Shizudai. And at that time, they offered a year-long Monbu Gakusho, I guess now, scholarship for 2 students every year. So I wrote the papers, did the interviews, got the recommendations, and in my senior year, I got the scholarship. I came here to Shizudai in the fall of 1990, and one of the first things I did was go to the gym here and watch an Aikido class and a Kendo class, bringing full circle my love for martial arts. I ended up joining Kendo right there, and I think my Shinai and Bogu is probably still in the room if you want to look. I stayed and I studied for 2 years. Then I had a decision to make, a hard one. Do I return to the States or do I remain in Japan? Most likely forever. Still wanted to be a writer, and still I just had no idea how. So I did some deep thinking and I made myself 2 promises. 1, I want to learn how to tell good stories. I want to tell stories that move people, encourage them, inspire them, make them cry, think, feel deeply, or stay up all night in fear. I want to make other people feel like I do when I read or hear a good story. In order to do number 1, I need to make life decisions that will lead to an interesting life, a life worthy of story. I've heard too many times about people in old age regretting all the chances they didn't take, and I don't want to be that person. Remember, I said we are our stories, our experiences, our memories. That's what makes us who we are. So why not create and live interesting ones, even if it might be difficult? So I decided to stay. Now, the Japan I knew from 2 years of university around people mostly my own age wasn't the Japan of Yaizu, where I ended up living in an old house in an old neighborhood, mostly elderly people, entirely elderly people, and it was very traditional. It was from living in that old neighborhood, in that old house, that I got an appreciation for an older Japan, one full of superstitions and folklore, myth, and yokai. I remember when I first discovered Gegege no Kitaro, and I thought this was the most brilliant thing in the entire world. This was before the internet, and manga and anime started making its way across the ocean, and everyone now just loves everything about Japan. But I wanted to share this incredible culture with others. That's when I finally began to write short stories, and I also studied how to write them. I submitted to hundreds of magazines. Again, this was before the internet, so I had to mail in these printed out pieces, wait months for replies, usually rejections. But with each rejection, I got better and I didn't give up. Finally, a magazine accepted one of my stories. It was called Sand Walls, Paper Doors. Remember that title, it's going to come back in a minute. Sand Walls, Paper Doors was about the old Japanese house I was living in at the time. But after years of living there, I had to leave because the landlord's daughter suddenly needed it. But that house and that neighborhood taught me so much about Japan and about myself, and I loved it and I wanted to honor it with a story. So it made me happy that that was the first piece I ever had published. I kept sending out stories the whole time, and more I started getting acceptances. At some point I thought I could make a collection out of these. So I studied the markets and I sent nice letters out, and to my delight, one publisher said they loved what I'd sent, and yes, they would publish them. I'd get an advance and everything, a real book deal with a traditional publisher. That book was called A Robe of Feathers and Other Stories. All the while, life is happening. I'm married at this point. I have a son. Years go by. I got really sick. I almost died 3 times, 3 different reasons. Those are big stories in and of themselves, but I won't talk about those now. Just know that there were dark days and there were dark stories. And I started writing more horror. Remember I told you I grew up reading Stephen King? So I used writing to get me through the bad stuff. I was experimenting too. One example is that I like the urban myth of the Jinmengyo, the fish that looks like it has the face of a man. So I started thinking, well, what if it was a man with the face of a fish? Or better, what if it was a boy? Wouldn't that be creepy? So I wrote a horror story called The Carp-Faced Boy, and it was published in a well-read magazine. Soon after that, a different publisher, came to me and asked if I had any more stories like this. They wanted to publish a new collection from me, and I did actually. So that's how my second short story collection got published, The Carp-Faced Boy and Other Tales. It came out, and after several months, I got an email saying it was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. That's kind of the top award for horror writers. So I was over the moon. I looked at who else was nominated alongside my collection, and there was the name Joe Hill. And Joe Hill, if you don't know, just happens to be Stephen King's son. I'm not even in his league. Joe Hill won, that's hands down. But in his acceptance speech, he mentioned that he had read all the other nominees, and then they were all great, and he encouraged everyone to read them too. So I had to laugh. Okay, maybe Stephen King wouldn't read my stories and love them, but I was on the ballot next to his very famous, very talented son. That was good enough. Goal achieved. Not everything was good. Life got very difficult after my son went to university, kind of continued on a downward spiral. Suddenly, I couldn't write anymore. One thing I realized is that I had been in Japan so long, speaking only Japanese, that I almost never spoke English. It kind of felt like my English side of my brain was withering. So I needed to both speak in English and start telling stories again. But how? Remember I told you about that very first story that I had published, Sand Walls, Paper Doors? Well, one day, there was some stranger in Japan on a train, and he was reading the book. He read that story, said it made him cry. And even though we didn't know each other, he found me on Twitter and he messaged me and he said how much he loved the piece. We talked a little bit. I learned that he was the first podcaster in Japan. So how many people know what a podcast is? Oh, yay. So podcast, if you don't know, is kind of like YouTube without the video, or radio that you can listen to anytime, anywhere, as long as you got a phone or anything. Podcasts can be educational, entertaining, hopefully both. Back in the day, this is again before the internet, his podcast was about life in Japan. And this is, again, Japan was still very mysterious. It was a very good show, and it was hugely successful. So by the time we were talking, he stopped podcasting, but he still had all the equipment and the know-how. I needed to do something to change the direction of my life and to start telling stories again. It was terrifying, but maybe I should start a podcast. I decided on a name, Uncanny Japan. And then I decided I would share with listeners all the little known, stranger parts of the culture. That was 6 years ago. And Uncanny Japan has had over 1.5 million downloads, been nominated for awards, and I get messages from people nearly every day. And that stranger who read my story and reached out, who lent me his microphone and helped me put the podcast up, still does. He's now my best friend, and we just started another podcast together this year. It's very weird, creative, unique, and that one's called Uncanny Robot. It's kind of an audio drama with a little touch of AI. It's very weird, so I like it. And that's where I am now. So first I wrote stories because I had to. By living in Japan, this incredibly unique culture, and being mesmerized by it, constantly being tested and taught, I was driven to write. I didn't understand exactly why at the time. I just wanted to share my experiences with others. And I also wanted to entertain. So those are my only two goals: share my experiences and entertain. And there's nothing wrong with that. But decades later, after getting beat up by life, I started telling stories in a different way. I spoke them out loud. Now, older, and on top of sharing my experiences and entertaining, I decided I wanted to try to educate people just a little bit. Even though we live in this globally connected world, where right now you can go on your phone, you can watch a live camera of Shibuya crossing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, see what's going on. I felt, and I still feel, that an older Japan is being lost. So I made the podcast Uncanny Japan, and I started researching things, talking about Zashiki Warashi or Hitobashira, or going to research Nanafushigi like Yonaki Ishi or Nekozuka, things like that. Something surprising happened. Along the way, I learned there were even more benefits to storytelling. I began connecting with thousands, hundreds, thousands of people around the world. Listeners of the show and readers of the book started reaching out to me by email, messaging, social media, and they thanked me for the show, but more wonderfully, they shared their stories with me. Incredible stories, heartbreaking stories, inspiring stories. From them, I learned that storytelling can also make you feel not so alone in the world. Stories can heal too, which is important during this whole Corona thing. So here I am right now, and I realize that storytelling isn't only about sharing information, educating, entertaining, making sense of the world. It's also about connecting with people in a meaningful way. And through that, healing and uplifting each other. Very recently, I had an epiphany and I reevaluated my goals and my dreams, kind of sharpened them. I'm going to continue the podcast, but I've also started writing again. This time, though, I feel I have more clarity of purpose and I know the direction I want my stories to go in. I'm very excited to see what happens there. And I had to edit my speech right here because when I started this speech, I wrote a story, I sent it out, and it's kind of a folk horror piece about the children's song Torianse. And happily, it was just accepted to an anthology and will be published next year. So that's roughly my story. So I want to know about yours. I'd like to end by encouraging all of you, if you don't already, to examine your lives and the stories around you, the ones that make you laugh, think, cry, the ones that move you deeply, the ones that help heal. Then pay attention to the stories that you are telling. And I don't mean like when you tell a curious experience about what happened on the Shinkansen. There are many different ways to tell stories. There's art, writing, of course, music, teaching, working, dancing, being a YouTuber. Are you educating, entertaining, understanding the world better? How are you helping? Remember too, if you need to, make choices that aren't so easy. Make choices that challenge you, broaden your thinking, enrich and deepen your life. Giving yourself more experiences to work with, talk about, and share with others. I think if we all do that, even just a little bit, we can make each other's lives happier, easier, and a little more magical. Thank you. And the piece I want to read is actually from The Carp-Faced Boy. It's just the very first couple pages. This is from the point of view of Grandpa Tetsu. He's an old man who may or may not be insane. The first part is called Horse and Bones. Grandpa Tetsu squatted behind the rustling curtain of a willow tree, his near crippled hands weaving horseshoes from lengths of stiff straw. With the completion and nodding off of each row, he squinted over at the one-storied thatched roof house, paper windows and doors thrown open to catch the breeze, to check to see if his family was sneaking up on him again. He needed to keep his distance, especially now that his daughter had returned and she wasn't alone. For weeks, he'd been battling a thorny ache inside his chest. It felt like the deep end of hunger, or possibly a warning. And then 2 nights ago, through the sheeting rain, he heard the neighing of a pained horse, and with it, a baleful cautioning only his keen ears could detect. He let his wife welcome his daughter and her son, the most unwelcome of guests, while he fell back asleep, certain that something very, very bad was going to happen soon. There was the sound of feet slapping wooden floors, but still no one came outside. The horse beside him shifted uncomfortably on its spongy hooves, and Grandpa Tetsu reached up and patted its ribbed belly. What kind of monster rode a limping horse all the way from the city in the pouring rain until its shoes tattered and fell off? The old man stood, balancing himself with one hand on the animal's sunken back. He stretched and slapped at the kinks in his crickety legs. Used to be, he could stand for most hours of the day, walk to Takakusa Mountain and back, and never tire. But that was long ago. He retrieved his wife's tortoiseshell comb from his sleeve and carefully began working the knots out of the creature's mane. Good boy. Grandpa Tetsu inhaled the dusty, sweaty, warm odor of the animal, and the knot in his chest eased. At least she brought you. The shrill scream of a child came from the direction of the house. Movement and laughter. The old man ducked. He watched as his wife and daughter burst from the open door and marched over. They planted their baskets of laundry not more than a stone's throw away from where he stood, crouching behind the horse's nervous legs. Not noticing him, the two began pulling water from the well. The child, strapped to his mother's back with long pieces of soft cloth, squirmed and kicked his chubby legs. It looked as if he might be in pain or possessed. The thought lingered a little too long, and almost as if he'd heard it, the boy stopped, turned, and looked directly at his grandfather. Something poisonous passed between them. Grandpa Tetsu shuddered and fell back against the tree. He'd been seen by the carp-faced boy. It was unnerving. Eyes goggling, startled wide, long, wet lashes. Grandpa Tetsu had never seen the child blink, not ever. That must mean something. Then there was the mouth, thick-lipped and downturned, every now and then popping open in that desperate, famished way, the candy-colored carp in the pond. When he first saw the child last spring, the old man had expected him to speak, to form a sentence or two, to say something frightful or wise. But no. Instead, from the empty cavity spilled only a long line of drool, and when disgruntled, the occasional howl, an ear-splitting, unnatural cry that continued until those heavy, sagging cheeks splotched red, and a more awful colored substance oozed from its nose. Something about the child was all wrong. The end, for now. Thank you.